So what if I told you all the internet advice out you telling you not to get muddy mixes and how to fix your muddy mixes is a complete lie and total scam? That's right, I found that there's so much advice about how to not get muddy mixes, yet it seems to me that amateur mixes are way too scooped, shrill, and bass heavy sounding than being too muddy. I've never come across an amateur mix that sounds too muddy to me. And actually, most amateur mixes sound way too scooped, don't have enough emphasis in the mid-range, don't have enough clarity there, because they're taking all this advice to scoop out everything between 200 and 600 hertz to heart, and they're doing it on every instrument and across their entire mix. And all you end up with is a mix that has no power, a little bit of sub that doesn't translate to systems that well, and sounds way too shrill in the high end. So in this video, I'm gonna explain to you how the whole muddy mixes thing is a complete myth and how you actually want to focus on mixing in the mid-range to get a great mix that translates across multiple different systems. Think about it, if you play your mix on a cell phone, right? How much sub information in 20K is gonna make it onto that cell phone speaker? Now, no doubt, cell phone speakers, they're getting better. It's pretty crazy actually, but nothing below 200, 300, 400 hertz is ever gonna make it into that tiny cell phone speaker, right? So why are we scooping those frequencies out when that's the only low end that's going to be left? In my opinion, you need to focus on the mid-range. So here's the top 3 ways to make the mid-range better in your mixes and not end up with that ridiculous amateur scooped curve that we've been seeing and hearing for so long. The number 1 tip to help the mid-range in your mixes is turn down your monitors. I've known so many amateur mixers that they just love to crank the monitors, get the mix super loud to make it sound super full. And while that's fun for tracking, and that's fun for enjoying and listening to music, that's not for mixing. Look at guys like CLA, Andrew Sheps, on and on it goes. These guys mix at very, very low volumes because they want their mixes to punch through, right? Andy Wallace is another great name, right? Where they mix actually super quiet. And these guys progressive rock and metal music, right? That punches really hard, that hits on your speakers, right? But they actually mix super quiet because they want that kick drum to cut through. Well, it's gonna need to cut through at a super low volume, right? Also, there's something called the Fletcher-Munson curve. And basically when you increase the volume of your speakers, it actually hypes the bass and low end in a way that's artificial, right? It seems like those frequencies are much higher than they actually are. You're not getting an accurate representation of what your mix is actually going to sound like. You might want to have close to 3 volumes when you're mixing. You're going to want to spend 80-90% of your time at that low level volume where you can hear everything that's going on, right? It's not playing, too quiet where you can't pick out anything, but a volume where you're sort of trying to hear the individual things, but like I said, not too quiet. And then I said, you want this volume to be an accurate representation of your mix, and you want to keep it there for most of your mixing time. The second volume would be an ultra low volume, where basically you can only hear maybe the vocal and the snare drum barely, right? That should be your balance at that ultra low volume. And then you can occasionally crank the mix up. Maybe you're gonna spot something like, wow, that vocal got really harsh when I cranked my speakers up, or maybe, hey, that bass guitar is really out of control. Let's add some multi-band compression, right? So it's okay to spend 5 to 10% of your mixing time at that high volume. But like I said, you're gonna wanna spend close to 80% of your time at that middle ground, right? That CLA mixing volume, right? Or the Andy Wallace mixing volume, right? Where you're making moves and decisions where it doesn't seem like a smear when everything's such a high volume. You're really gonna end up with better mixes because that mid-range is gonna be emphasized and not affect everything else. Number 2 is the filter EQ trick, right? I don't recommend mixing like this all the time or spending your entire mix like this, but it can be good to check how your mid-range is sounding on your speakers and in your room. Simply take an EQ curve on your master track, and I would cut everything from I would do a high pass up to 300-400 hertz, and I do a low pass at about 6K-ish. Now hear the mix in that context. How's the mix sounding? Is the vocal still clear? Is the kick drum still getting through? Is the snare drum too far back or too muddy, right? You'll get a good idea of how your mix is going to translate across different systems. Make a few different changes there. Don't go crazy with that. That's just sort of a check for balance, and then take that off so you can kind of hear how those changes were fitting the rest of the context of the mix. It's a good little trick there. Like I said, don't overdo it with this one, okay? We don't need to mix through, a ridiculous filter or something like that. I think that kind of has its issues as well. Same thing with like mixing in mono. It's good to check things in mono, but to actually mix in mono, I think maybe creates some imbalances there. So go ahead, try that out as well, and try it on your low volume. I think you'll end up with a much more balanced mix that sounds pretty good across all systems. And then my third and final tip would be check your mix on some crappy speakers. That's like I said, bounce that mix out, play it on your phone, play it on your old Dell laptop, play it on 20-year-old tiny speakers, right? See how that mix sounds. Make sure the kick drum's cutting through. Make sure the vocal can be heard, right? Make sure that the top end is not too shrill. Even CLA in his studio has an old boombox that he occasionally puts the mix on just to make sure everything's cutting through and the balance is there, right? You wanna make sure that if your mix is playing in a mall, someone pulls it up on a cell phone, right? someone has a really bad car stereo system, that they can still pull up that mix and they can still enjoy it because the balance is there. You focused on the right areas, right? You don't have too much of this crazy sub and high end that gets lost when that mix, finally comes to be rendered down and all the energy is gone because there's no low mid frequencies, there's no mid frequencies, there's no bite in that vocal because it was all put in the 20 hertz, high airy frequencies, right? So that would be my third tip for helping to emphasize that mid-range and get it to sound good across. So there you go, that's me completely debunking the muddy mixes myth, right? I don't think, unless you're boosting tons and tons of 300 and 400 hertz all the time, in my opinion, you're not gonna end up with muddy mixes. When I've done my mixes for my various albums or for clients, right, I found that my mixes always end up being a little too scooped and I have to add in some mid-range to finally get it there to match the reference. If you're not using a reference track, you need to pull in a reference track during your mixing phase. Make sure your mid-ranges match. Use that filter trick comparing your mix to their mix. Make sure that the mid-ranges sound, they don't have to sound exactly the same. They may be different tracks, but make sure that they're in a similar ballpark. And so when you play your mix or it pulls up on Spotify or someone loads it into their car, that it's not going to be too much of a drastic change between your mix and their mix. So I hope this was helpful. I have a guide called the Home Studio Gear Guide. You can get that 100% free in the description box down below. That outlines all the gear you need to start building out your home studio. It's supposed to be affordable. It's supposed to be for people who are into home studio, right? It's not going to cost thousands of dollars, okay? This is supposed to help you get started. It's some products that I use. I'm not sponsored by any of the products. Go ahead, click the description box down there. If you like this video and you found it informative, you should hit the subscribe button and like the video down below. It helps out the channel and gets it out to the algorithm so we can help other musicians make their own music. I'm Make the Music, and thank you guys so much for watching.